Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. My name is Karen Corman, and I have the privilege of being the Executive Director of the UIC Alumni Association. Welcome to the UIC Alumni Exchange Series. We are hosting weekly events that bring you news, knowledge, and entertainment to help you explore, connect, and even escape from the everyday with a community of UIC alumni and faculty experts. You'll hear me say this a few times today, but I encourage you to visit go.uic.edu/alumni exchange for the latest and greatest programming. Just a few housekeeping items before we get started. As you may have noticed when you came in, all participants are muted. We do recommend that you stay in speaker view, which you can select in the upper right-hand corner of the Zoom feature. It is always better to see your faces, so we'd love for you to keep your cameras on. As I mentioned before, if you have questions throughout, please put them in the chat box and we will get to them as we can towards the end of the program during Q&A. Please do be aware that this program is being recorded and will be available in approximately 10 days afterwards at the UIC Alumni Exchange website. And while we have taken precautions to prevent intruders, please know that if our session is unexpectedly and inappropriately interrupted, we will immediately end this session and will send an email with additional information. And finally, you will receive a 30-second survey after the presentation. Please do let us know your thoughts as it helps us with future programming. And with that, I'm excited to start our program this afternoon. The beat goes on: music, culture, and creativity during a crisis. We welcome Distinguished Professor of Communications, Dr. Steve Jones. I'm going to turn it over to Professor Jones to introduce himself a bit, and please join me in welcoming him. Professor Jones.
Thanks so much. It's a privilege and honor to be here and share this time with you. Explore, inform, entertain. I'll try to do all those things. Entertain could be a tall order for a professor. What can I say? So our goal today is really, what I'd like to do is give you a little bit of a historical perspective on where popular music has been with regard to various crises, including previous pandemics, and to talk a little bit about where it is now and possibly where it's headed. And with that in mind, in a little while, I'd like to bring in a couple of musicians who have, I think, quite a few things to say about the current state of affairs for music and for musicians, Sam Rosenthal and Michael Hogue, and I'll give them a full introduction in a little bit. A little bit about me, my background: I have a bachelor's degree in biology of all things, and then a master's in journalism. My PhD is in communication. I've worked in experimental music studios and the digital computing lab at UIUC, and I've been a musician, a recording engineer, producer, record label owner, and I'm currently a faculty member in communication and in computer science and a research associate in the electronic visualization lab at UIC, otherwise known as EVL at UIC. I always enjoy showing these images whenever I'm speaking with UIC or UIUC alumni, because this is really what kind of kicked off my deep interest in computers and computing and all things digital. This is a Play-Doh 4 computer terminal. It was in computer labs throughout the Urbana campus and at UIC. And it was really the first computer network that launched the kinds of things that we do on the internet today, ranging from chat to web pages and so on. I do another presentation occasionally for groups that I called Everything I Know About the Internet I Learned from Play-Doh, and it's direct reference to this. So if any of you joining us today had experience with Play-Doh, I'd love to hear what your experiences were. I'll have an email address up afterwards, and hopefully this brings back some good memories. The image on the right, by coincidence, is one of myself on the left and my roommate on the right, which I have just randomly found on the web that apparently somebody took when we were undergraduates. And as I was looking for Play-Doh images, there it was. Who knew? So the outline for today, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about music in regard to memory and meaning, in regard to creativity, spend some time talking about the history of music with regard to various crises in US history, and then wrap up with some discussion of audience and economics of music in conversation with musicians about music in the pandemic, and take some time, obviously, for your questions and some discussion afterward too. Music and sound are really strong memory triggers. One of the things that always has struck me and that I always say about myself is if I could put the memory capacity that I have for song lyrics to something actually useful, like medicine, maybe, I could do really amazing things. My brain is full of tens of thousands, is probably understating, lyrics to songs. But why is that? Well, one of the reasons for that, probably the strongest reason for it, is that music becomes embedded in our memory. We have all had experiences, and every time I bring this up, I feel like I should give a disclaimer, because even the mention of the term earworm has the potential to trigger an earworm. Basically, an earworm is any little repetitive piece of music, of melody usually, that gets stuck in our head that we cannot get rid of. Our brains work in very mysterious ways when it comes to sound and music. But this is also put to good use. So epic poems from antiquity were set to music as a way to remember the text of those poems. The Odyssey, the Iliad, any number of Greek epics were actually sung. They weren't written in their initial versions, and were a form of folk music, right, that relied on passing history on over time, and would slightly alter as different people would perform them, much as contemporary folk music has to this day. You might think of, as an example here, the music of Woody Guthrie, which chronicled another crisis in US history, namely Dust Bowl, whose songs continue to reverberate today and are performed by hundreds, thousands probably of musicians in slightly varying forms that record that period in art history and that morph over time as people hear them and make them their own in some fashion. To give you a little bit of an example of what Homer would have sounded like when it was sung, some of you may have encountered the Odyssey or other Homeric verse in your courses, perhaps at UIC. You might have been interested in hearing what that sounded like when it was sung. Let me stop that. Stop. In many instances, there was a single string instrument that was used for accompaniment. This was true throughout the Balkans, for instance, and these melodies would simply serve as a trigger to memory, a mnemonic device, a way to keep remembering what the words are, what the lyrics are, as the story goes along. Music is part of our language too. It's part of how we speak. We don't generally think about it because we generally don't hear ourselves musically when we speak, or other people. But Diana Deutsch, who's a professor of psychology at UC San Diego, has done some fascinating work on speech as singing. And one example of what she talks about is the speech to song illusion. And I'll play just a little excerpt of this, and we'll see if you can hear how musical speech can in fact sound as she starts to speak a sentence and then edits it and loops it so that you can hear the melody that results from so doing.
Professor Jones, we're not hearing the sound on this side.
Oh, you're not getting sound?
The sound did not come through.
That's strange. Let me try that again.
Appear to you are not only different from those that are really present, but they sometimes behave so strangely as to seem quite impossible. But they sometimes behave so strangely. They sometimes behave so strangely. Sometimes behave so strangely. Sometimes behave so strangely. Sometimes.
Right, I'll stop that because that is probably, well, it has a strong potential to become an earworm the more you listen to it. And one of the other disclaimers perhaps should be that now that I've told you this, what you may find happens, as happens to me, is that you start thinking about it and you'll hear yourself actually more musically than you had and become very self-conscious about it. Other scientists like Daniel Levitin have shown that in fact music was evolutionarily advantageous because it promoted social bonding and communication and understanding. And I think we see some of this in the current pandemic. Some of the most moving images, for instance, that we saw from Italy early in its battle against coronavirus was of people on balconies, at windows, singing. We did some of that in Chicago as well. Other places have done it. Just singing together is a very powerful way for humans to communicate with one another and to let one another know, sort of simply, well, we're here, right? And we understand each other and we share something together. For Levitin and others, this shows not only in these kind of socio-cultural terms, but they've been able to show through fMRI and other techniques that in fact areas of the brain are specifically triggered and seem to have evolved for that purpose, for not only processing sound, but of making sense of it in very specific ways that other animals actually don't have. So there is good evidence for some evolutionary advantage from music for humans. Maybe most interestingly, in some ways, our individual experiences of listening tie us to our own histories, to our memories, our feelings. Most of us remember where we were when we first heard a song, and we can clearly recollect those moments the next time we hear the song. Most of us make playlists in a very deliberate fashion to reflect moods, but not only to reflect moods, also to create moods, or in some sense to recreate moods that we had when we perhaps first heard those pieces of music. And in some ways, those memories just become all the more vivid as we're able to recollect not just the music and lyrics, but the places we were when we heard those songs, the people we were with, and other things that we might have shared, including, for instance, when we heard those songs in a social context, like if we were at a concert or other sort of performance. One of the interesting things about this, though, is that music really only has general meaning. Most of its meaning is culturally signified. In other words, music has formal elements, right? You don't really need to know music or theory to understand that there's rhythm, there's tempo, there's major and minor keys, and all of these impart some meaning to music, but they don't guarantee meaning. So there's a little, on this slide, I've got an image borrowed from Irene Garofalo, who illustrated Stuart Hall's notion of meaning making, of encoding and decoding, that goes on through all popular culture. You produce a piece of music, it's received and it's adopted and reused, and it becomes part of popular culture at all of these moments. So you can think of maybe the recent example, and it may not be the greatest example because it was also somewhat received somewhat dismissively by critics in particular, but you can think of John Lennon's Imagine and its meaning perhaps to you, and then you can think of the Gal Gadot version that she used with a bunch of her celebrity friends, whether as an Instagram or TikTok or some such, and which was sort of roundly dismissed as this kind of celebrity pandering in a time of crisis. So the meaning of that song, in some sense, hasn't changed, but through its use in different contexts, it acquires a different meaning. So that's kind of a long way around really of saying that there's no fixed meaning for music, that its meaning changes all the time in different contexts. I go back to Woody Guthrie again. Some of his songs that were for lack of a better term, rather depressing, have actually now come to seem uplifting, or in some cases serve as children's music. So with time, there's a kind of cultural shift in how we come to understand what music means, not just individually, personally to ourselves, but more generally kind of to culture at large. A little bit of a shift to this notion of creativity now, because these notions of memory and meaning infuse how musicians create too. There's only so many notes, there are only so many scales, there are only so many rhythms and so on. And you could say that really it's the combination of these things that musicians are inspired to create by their own encounters with music is what drives their creativity. Sociologist and ethnomusicologist Jason Toynbee put it, the composer, novelist, or painter is supposed to be a special kind of being whose creativity and imagination rise up above the banality of everyday life and the everyday psyche. But the popular musician, on the other hand, is exemplary just because she comes from the people and cleaves to popular values. So the interesting thing to me about popular music has always been that it is something that's made potentially by anybody, for anybody, doesn't necessarily require special knowledge, special understanding, and comes from a kind of ability simply to communicate through words or music, something very human, something very relevant that other people pick up on. And as Toynbee put it, popular music is both ordinary and marvelous because it shows us what might have been if only. And what he means by that is when we see a popular musician performing, many people simply go to that place of thinking, well, if only I had played the guitar longer, or if only I had taken those piano lessons. It's that ordinariness of it, and the lifting up of that ordinariness to make it extraordinary that makes popular music special. On the other hand, there's always been that tension between music and commerce. What is popular music if not also commercial music? And so there's always been this kind of tension between, is popular music authentic, or is it just being created to be sold as something that's going to then potentially be thought of as selling out? So to tie this a little bit more into history before we get into some discussion with our guests, the most obvious parallel to the present with regard to music is 1918, really 1917. There's a terrific book called Making Music American, 1917 and the Transformation of Culture, that talks about transformations in very specifically focusing on music and to a lesser extent on culture generally in the US as the country was grappling with entering World War I, but also enduring the flu pandemic at that time. What Bomberger does is follow the lives of about a dozen musicians during that period to show how they were individually affected very, very differently and very distinctly, but with some common threads. And I do recommend the book if you have a chance to pick it up. The parallels, one was in politics. There were debates about American music and foreign musical influences, right? And what proper American music could and should be. So various symphony orchestras around the country were quick to add various patriotic tunes to the start of their programs, particularly if they were otherwise performing opera or German music, because German music was seen as anti-American. And in fact, some German conductors were deported and in one case, at least sent to an internment camp for being perceived as anti-American because they refused to add patriotic music to their symphonies repertoire. And one of the consequences of this was that classical music actually in that 1917-1918 period receded fairly rapidly from the popular repertoire, even in those cases where various orchestras tried to incorporate patriotic music. And Dixieland jazz subsequently became enormously popular, particularly because it was seen as a kind of indigenous music, right? A US American music, not necessarily patriotic music per se, but a music that developed in America and reflected American values. Technology changed during this time too for audio recording and playback. This image is of a portable phonograph that was designed and built for the troops. It was called the Army and Navy model. And it was built by the Edison Company, specifically so that it could be transported not just to Europe, but also easily transported by the troops. There were about 250 parts, all numbered and easily, supposedly, assembled and disassembled to be carted around but I suppose potentially from trench to trench, potentially. And one of the things that you also see at this point is that there are refinements in the ability to more accurately record and reproduce music. So partly this was to reflect a greater interest in recorded music being available to the public who were decreasingly going to hear live music as concert venues were being closed down. And gatherings of large groups were being discouraged or banned outright. Up to that point, there was some, really the main revenue source for musicians at that point was performance. It was live music. A secondary source was published music, sheet music, and recordings had not really, although they existed, were not really coming into their own as a major source of revenue. They were still, to some extent, a bit of a novelty. And part of the reason for that was that they simply didn't sound that good. And from about 1905 to about 1925, there's an enormous advance in the quality of recording that then kind of took a quantum leap in the mid-1920s as electrical recording took off. To give you a little bit of a taste of some of those differences, I have two quick examples here. One is the Maple Leaf Rag, which many of you are probably familiar with, which is a 1907 recording. And then the original Dixieland Jazz Band's Livery Stable Blues from 1917, which is the earliest known jazz recording that we have a record of. And what I'd like you to listen to, if you can, through this medium of Zoom, which ironically enough may not be good enough for us to discern the differences between the 1907 and 1917 recordings, but fingers crossed you'll be able to hear them. Because there is, I think, a remarkable difference in quality between these two that really illustrates in a very short period of time, in only 10 years, and without the benefit of electronics, how much progress was made in how music sounded in a recorded medium. So the first one here is the Maple Leaf Rag from 1907. And then the second example is from 1917, Livery Stable Blues. So I hope that what you're able to hear was that the 1917 recording has a much broader dynamic range, much greater range of soft to loud, but also a much greater frequency range. The instruments are much more individually discernible. There's less noise on the recording. And in an era in which we didn't have electronics to record, we literally had large horns. Sort of think of the RCA Victor Victrola image of a large horn emanating from a phonograph. The recording studio was the opposite of this. It was a horn that the performers performed into that went to a cutting lathe that then cut the master recording. So really, the only things you could experiment with were the horns, the materials, the rooms, the acoustics of the space, and those sort of things. There's some wonderful images that show this array of horns in a very large room that musicians would have to stand in front of, that would all be connected by tubes to a single tube that would then go into the phonograph, and that was recording back in the day. So once jazz became quite popular, that in and of itself actually helped kick off the recording industry too, as demand grew for listening to music, and again, particularly American music, in the home. Oops. Stop. All right. So at in that era too, musicians were hit particularly hard, since, as I mentioned, most of their income was from touring and live performance. One of the headlines that Bomberger notes in his book was "Influenza closes many concert halls," and there were efforts to try to publish as much music as possible, as much sheet music as possible, to try to bring in that income from that side of things. Just as a quick aside, interestingly, in a Chicago court, one of the members of the original Dixieland Jazz Band tried to kind of break off from the group and publish their own sheet music of Livery Stable Blues. And the leader of the original Dixieland Jazz Band sued him. And the judge basically claimed all blues were the same and therefore could not be copyrighted. So that tells you a little bit about how early we are in the understanding of jazz and blues, that arguments about the validity of the music as kind of individual artistic expression were not going to be heard, no pun intended, by a judge, at least here in Chicago, which of course itself was a hotbed of blues and jazz. So let me say a few words about audiences and economics, and then we'll move on to some thoughts and discussion from our guests. As I already mentioned, there's always been that art versus commerce debate in popular music. Probably nowhere is it more true than in popular music. And musicians are always adaptable, although in the last 20 or so years, the internet has stretched the limits of adaptability somewhat. As musicians have gone from having sales of recorded music to streaming as a source of income, and have had to navigate those shifts. It's caused a sea change, and certainly caused some crisis not only for musicians but also for record companies, publishers. Audiences have had to adapt as well. Most of us are now adept at streaming music. We didn't even have this language, streaming, much more than 10 years ago when it came to music. And many of us are now seeing living room concerts. There's various television specials that involve having sing-alongs too. And it makes, it certainly made me wonder whether audiences might want some of that to continue. There is a certain intimacy and entertainment value of having people who you would not otherwise get to see perform live, performing weekly in their living rooms, kind of letting you into their homes on a regular basis. And some of those are able to generate some revenue for those musicians. There's a variety of means like Stage It, for instance, that allow a virtual tip jar capability as a means of trying to sustain some of those musicians' work. There's other means like Patreon and Bandcamp and so on as well. And so some of this may come to be a regular facet of what musicians do, both as a means of generating some revenue, but also as a means of staying in touch with an audience in a way that kind of connects maybe more directly than social media does. It's an open question, though, in those contexts, whether musicians are going to get live feedback in the same way that they do when they're performing at a concert. Much the same way that it's difficult for me to get feedback from all of you joining today, or to get feedback when I'm teaching online. The medium has some consequences here for the message. And so the last sort of question I have here is, whether tastes might change. You also don't get quite the same, obviously you don't get the same sound, you don't get the same experience that you do in concert, but nevertheless, maybe we will develop a taste for having this kind of a musical experience alongside the many others that we have. So to talk a little bit about this and kind of bring it up to the present, I'm joined today by Sam Rosenthal, who is out in Portland, Oregon. He's the owner of Project Records and a musician. His label was founded in 1983 and has over 200 releases. He performs primarily as Black Tape for a Blue Girl, which he started in 1986, but is frequently a solo performer and has side projects as well. And Michael Hogue, who's a working tubist and teacher in Chicago, and has performed with the Chicago Jazz Philharmonic, the Big Shoulders Brass Band, Buca Pasa, Lake Forest Symphony, one of my favorites, Dr. John, Howard Levy, and a whole lot of others. And I want to thank you both for joining today and giving us your perspective on kind of where things are at and where they might be headed for music and musicians.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Feel free to jump in. What any general thoughts you'd like to share about kind of how you're trying to cope with just cope with music, let's put it that way, and with your livelihoods and creative work as musicians.
Yeah, the number one thing that is missing right now is the ability to basically bounce things off other musicians in the way that we do, because everything is going digital and online, and what can we use to virtually play together, but it's not the same by any means. And it basically feels like going back to the woodshed, because everything has to be with a click. It's really hard to get any kind of that feedback, and that for me has been the toughest part. And I can foresee a lot of musicians and bands starting to break the rules just to get a taste of that again first. That's just initial thought that I had.
Mm-hmm.
How about for you, Sam?
Some of
Sam.
the,
Here you go.
all right, can you guys hear me over there?
Yeah, we got you now.
All right, yeah, I've been watching some of the live streaming from bands on my own label as well as other labels, and I'm like, wow, I'm watching this guy from 5 feet away instead of like halfway across a hall. This is amazing. I really appreciate this change of how you see a live show, even if it is just one person performing now. And a lot of the bands in the label, they can't tour anyway because there's not enough support in any one city. But now they can play a show that's for everybody. So it has a way of working out better for artists. It's a strange way to come about this, but the ability to play a show that everyone in the world can watch is a pretty good thing.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, one of the questions, of course, is, how come we didn't think of this sooner? I mean, necessity is the mother of invention, but it's interesting that this, because I hadn't really noticed much of this kind of thing happening prior. There'd be these occasional, sort of sweepstakes type things, right? Where, you could sort of enter a raffle and maybe you could have somebody perform, a concert for you, or, enter a contest and somebody will come to your backyard or something, that kind of thing. So it's interesting to see this become adopted more widely. But do you think it's sustainable going forward? I mean, do you think where do you think this will sort of fit in this kind of larger universe of musical experience once we get somewhere past this?
I hope it's sustainable. I enjoy it quite a bit because, like, I watched my friend in New York City. They were playing an online festival, and they don't tour enough where they get out here to Portland, but I can watch them do a show. So I think that it has advantages. These are all free shows also. It's not like I've seen people I know trying to charge for these yet. They do the tip jar like you suggested. And I think I did a live Q&A thing maybe 7 years ago, and I had between 0 and 5 people watching. And then I did one a week ago, and I think I had 85 people watching, something like that. And now the videos had 600 views. So it definitely also has to do with people maybe having better internet service, getting used to the technology and doing it that way. So it's, the improvement of time of people having the technology too.
I think it'll absolutely become a staple of pretty much anyone and everyone that plays music. I think it'll be expected from this point on because our whole audience has been taught to do this now. So, I mean, I can remember not so long ago playing live and kind of catching someone with their phone recording us and tapping the band leader on the shoulder and saying, hey, this guy is, crossing a line here, sort of thing. And that was, I remember that as a first experience, but now it's most definitely commonplace. If you go out to a show, there's probably at least 15 phones going and maybe live streaming, and at the very least being shared on individuals social media. So that I can remember when that shift happened, and it was just really because the technology was available and social media was becoming the norm. So I definitely see people sitting down to watch a concert online as becoming a much bigger part and sticking around for a long time. Yeah,
it reminds me in some ways of kind of the very early going back to college. I had friends, Ernie and Cynthia, who would put on house shows, and you'd pass a hat kind of thing. And it's sort of been flipped in a sense in some ways, like classrooms have been flipped thanks to the technology. So we can do this virtually. But it does still, because I mean, in so many ways, musicians have been the vanguard of technology, right? I mean, if you look at everything that we're doing now with streaming, with audio files, and so, I mean, this really came from the kind of the late 1990s in music. This whole notion of file sharing, of being able to create and maintain large music libraries, of having portable devices for carrying that music around. There's always musicians, when it comes to technology, have always been somewhat in the forefront, particularly popular music. And I think we're seeing some of that now too. And I'm wondering, do you think music itself might change to accommodate the technology? In other words, so one of the things you see, for instance, is presumably to a click track, right? You see, kind of the tiled band, right? You have however many members are on the screen, and so it's a sort of, I don't know what you would call it, a semi-live or pseudo-live performance. I mean, for a solo artist or somebody, maybe living with another musician, right? You can do this without having to resort to that. Do you think there's going to be a little bit of move toward music that you can more easily and more successfully perform kind of individually, or are we going to see this become more elaborate, with more people performing on screen kind of simultaneously in some fashion?
I think maxing out on having a lot of people together, I think that's going to go away once this all goes away, just because it's a big pain in the butt to line everything up with that many people. But I think that what you're going to get is an openness to collaborate with people that don't live in your city quite a bit more, because that's really what we're doing now. Honestly, all of the little collaborations I've been part of, no one lives around here. That's kind of the cool aspect about it is, oh, my buddy's back in Colorado, we can play together again. So I see that sticking around. But I think that if we can be in the same room and put stuff out, I think that's going to be the part that sticks longer.
May I jump in? Oh, I'm sorry. Please go ahead, Sam.
Oh, I was going to say, I'm more kind of collaboration with a guy in Italy who I've never met and I've never spoken to on the phone. I mean, I don't know this guy really, it's just we're working on music together. And that technology has already been there. I was going to add, though, with Project, most of the artist's income is from sales as opposed to the live area. And so the unknown for us right now is, what is 2 months going to look like when we start getting paid for now? All we know is what we're getting paid for from Christmas in January. So there's still this sort of frightening unknown of what's coming.
If I may jump in with some audience questions, and if there's
please do.
Please put them in chat. And I think, Michael, you just alluded to this a little bit, as we see these large, frankly, mini concerts going on, where I think it was the Denver Symphony Orchestra that played Ode to Joy. And we saw Disney's now doing sing-alongs, and we saw Hamilton, the original cast, putting together these things. They are not live, I don't believe, while they're doing it. It's all recorded. You touched upon this, but the question is, how prepared was the music industry for this kind of technology and to pull these things off? I mean, we watch them, they last 3 minutes long, but my sense is that they take much longer to actually coordinate and to play or sing collectively.
I feel like the technology has been here, even starting 5-7 years ago, for doing at least live streaming stuff. There's maybe better editing software now for live. It's just, some people had already started using it and some people had to figure it out pretty quickly. So I have a friend who does, every Monday, he does 5 songs at 5 o'clock on Facebook. He's using that medium for it. Some people are using YouTube. But I do feel like everything needed already existed. I don't know how much it was getting used.
Yeah, similar to how Zoom existed before all this, but now I'm sure Zoom is through the roof. And then here's a scramble for a lot of other people to come up with their own platforms that may be better. I think it existed before. As far as what musicians were prepared to do, I think that there are certain types of music or certain levels of musicians that were more prepared than others. People that record more or have a history of recording, I think, did better, because it's honestly easier if you're in time. That's a big part of it, and just syncing stuff up is so important, and that's, you know, part of what is missing when you're playing in the same room with other people. You can speed up and slow down a little bit and still sound good, and that's generally what happens. And then, you know, if you have a band that maybe is a little bit looser, when it's time to go in the studio, then you tighten things down a bit. So the guys that were already tight, I think we're ready to go. So anything that was already very produced, like a Hamilton troupe getting together, that was probably relatively easy to do. So I guess the guys that are a little bit looser, it's a little bit harder for.
Yeah. Nothing makes you appreciate great bandwidth and low latency,
Yeah.
like playing music together online.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm finding that in teaching too. I still teach a lot of individual lessons, and I just can't play with students anymore. That right now is not an option. I'm just using, you know, whatever the student may have, is typically FaceTime or Zoom, but you can't play with them. You can't even both turn on a metronome and play with. So there's an aspect that's been lost there as well, but we'll get back together again soon.
Yeah, to get it on the same beat, of course.
Right.
As a follow-up question, will future musicians struggle if they are not tech or social media literate?
Well, I think
they already do.
Yeah, I was going to say, that struggle I've been telling the artists on the label, they have to be online and they have to be their main promotional person, because that's what people want nowadays. So this might even push it along faster, but it's been an issue for 10 years at least.
Yeah, I agree. I feel behind the curve myself and all that, just because my social media presence is really just Facebook, and I'm not on Instagram, I'm not on Twitter and any of that sort of thing. So I feel myself even a little get off my lawn about that whole aspect. So yes, I think it will be necessary, and I'm talking to myself as well.
I understand that.
Yeah.
Well, it's hard, right? I mean, and this is part of, I think, what I was alluding to, you know, with regard to, you know, our living room concert kind of thing is going to become a mainstay, right? Because, you know, if you're a musician, and I agree with you, Sam, you have to do the social media thing. You have to have a presence. You've always had to do some promotion and marketing, but you never really had to do it quite so immediately, right? It never had to be kind of an everyday part of your life. You never had to think about your messaging, except maybe when you were talking to a journalist, right? Somebody who was interviewing you. And, you know, so now, you know, you're going to potentially add this to kind of this array of things that you need to do as a musician, in addition to performing, to practicing, to writing and creating, recording, social media, doing press, and now you're going to have potential living room concerts. So, you know, and when you're on the road, you're probably going to be posting on social media, and you know, what social media, right? I mean, because these tend to proliferate. And so are you going to maintain your living room concerts? So if you're on tour, are you going to do a hotel room concert? You know, if you have a regular sort of online gig, are you going to do, you know, so I'm kind of curious, and I don't think there's an answer, you know, it's purely speculation at this point, but is this going to sort of continue? Is this going to add to that sort of palette of things that as a musician you have to do in order to stay current after this is over? And, you know, how much time is there in a day that you can add this into the mix?
You know, I would just jump in historically to say, if you look at Dali or Picasso, I mean, they were that marketing person all day for themselves. that is sort of a thing that some key artists have been doing for a long time to really make it about themselves and promote themselves. So that's kind of what I tell artists is, look at Andy Warhol. He did this in the 60s. He was promoting himself all day. So you can get online for like a half hour and do some social networking. I guess that a lot of the artists I work with don't tour anyway. So this could be an opportunity to play shows they never would have played. So I hope it continues. I hope people start using this as a way to connect. Once you watch a few of these live concerts where the artist is stopping to chat between songs, either tell stories or respond to questions in the chat window, you kind of, Facebook is so flat. You post a message and it's words, but this is actually the person looking at you and talking to you. I think that adds a level that's not there otherwise.
It's hard though to drive that engagement with the audience though, isn't it? I mean, it's one thing to get, to post something on Twitter, Instagram, and then see the response. But if you're performing, at home, on Facebook or whatever the medium might be, are you going to try to read kind of the chat notices as they come up? How are you going to gauge the reactions of the audience?
Well, that's what I've seen the people do. They actually, their head down there by the monitor and they're looking in and, oh, hey, Bob, good thing you came in. I'm going to do that song you were asking about later. It's very, they're cramming their face down close to see what the words are in the chat. And I think that makes it much more immediate.
And
I'm sorry, go ahead, Michael.
I was going to say that I think that there has been kind of a step toward this. You see more and more guys flipping open their phones while they're on the gig and doing a live stream of what's going on, and or then that video replays, and then occasionally, especially for horn players who have a guitar solo off, they'll reach down and they'll look and read and respond in that way, and it's kind of exciting that way. And it's a little dangerous as a musician. You don't want to get caught not coming in, that sort of thing, but that was happening more and more, and it was a way to engage an online audience like in the moment. So once we can get back together, I see that as continuing and maybe becoming more and more.
This might be, so I think we have time for one last question. This might be a good follow-up to your comment. From one of our participants, do you think that this living room concerts or cozy entertainment culture that the pandemic / post-pandemic has created will also change the nature of popular music itself, the field, the lyrics, etc.? Since a lot of creating and experiencing pop music globally is about physical proximity and close community.
That's an awesome question. That's great question.
I think there's an intimacy it's creating that probably has been lacking, and I'm not sure if people who consider themselves big-time celebrities are ready to go into that kind of intimacy. I'll be interested to see if Lady Gaga or Madonna or whoever wants to sit there and be chatting directly with 100,000 people at once. It would be interesting to see, though.
I agree with that.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I was just saying, also just the revenue side. There was another question about how people are doing everything for free right now. So how do you, beyond the tip jar, go from a Lady Gaga concert series, which is bringing in gazillions of dollars? That's an official term, gazillions of dollars, to to what that looks like.
For someone on the level of a Lady Gaga, I don't see her doing something like that unless she just really wants to anyways. It wouldn't come anywhere near making the kind of money that she's making. I could see her doing something to help sustain other members of her band and production company, and then just send all the funds to them, so more on the fundraising side. But for kind of everyone else, I think maybe there could be a shift, as Sam was saying, like now it's much more personal, and you're inviting people into my homes. You guys know what my office looks like, and we see what Sam's office there looks like. So it is kind of putting a personal face on it, and I think that will leak into the music as well.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I think one of the interesting things to see here is going to be whether this scales up, right? Because what you do as a musician in almost every era is you build up a following, right? Over time, you assuming that you have an audience to start with, you can grow that audience, and will it grow? And as it grows, what will happen to it? As it scales up, will the technology be able to accommodate? If you're now an up and coming musician, and this is your mode of not just reaching out to your fans, but also growing a fan base, at what point does it become potentially difficult, right, to use this medium if you're going to grow much larger? Right, traditionally you would maybe do house parties, and then maybe graduate to small clubs, and then larger clubs, and so there's that sort of stepping stone approach to kind of increasing popularity. I think it's an interesting question to see whether this is going to accommodate, at what level does this sort of start to become more difficult potentially?
Well, and I have been trying to watch a big band like the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, who really is dependent on packing the house to make it worthwhile, because that's a stage full of top-notch musicians who have six-figure salaries, not to mention all of the union guys working the stage, and it costs a lot of money to put on a live performance, and until there can be a full audience, I don't see it being worthwhile for a group like that. And so what is their sustainability? I mean, are they going to just call it off for a year? And then what do those musicians do? How many of them will return if it takes that long? But that may be what is necessary. And I don't really know what they're doing right now besides the individuals, whatever they feel like doing. But as I don't know what content someone like the CSO is putting out right now to maintain their audience.
So I think we've reached the end of our allotted time. And as musicians, right, it's incumbent on us to finish on time and on the beat. And I think that's a good point at which to do it. I really, Sam, Mike, I really want to thank both of you very much for joining in.
Yeah.
And all of you who've joined in as well, and for the absolutely excellent questions. Thank you so much. I hope you found this interesting, entertaining, and informative.
Yes, well, thank you, Professor Jones. I absolutely was a fascinating discussion, and appreciate your presentation, and also to Sam and Michael for their contributions. We very much appreciate you sharing your expertise. And we also want to say thank you to our colleagues in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences for their partnership. Next week, please join us on Monday, May 18th for our next UIC Alumni Exchange event at noon, featuring our UIC Chancellor, Michael Amaritis, who will share an update from UIC and answer questions. And of course, you can find more information at go.uic.edu/alumni exchange. Please be on the lookout for that quick survey. I promise you it will not take more than 30 seconds. Thank you again to Professor Jones and to our guest speakers for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you again in our next UIC Alumni Exchange. Thanks so much, and have a great rest of your day.
Take care, everybody.
Thank you.